And we can welcome back Naveen Sandhu again from AkzoNobel. Thank you for being here. Stuart Hansen from Exalta, Powder Coatings, and Tristan Pope from Vertical. So we're talking again, really, where you ended up, I guess, Naveen, on the facades. What can be done to assist the architectural specification sector in understanding the implications for powder coating under the fire safety changes to building regulations? That's the first question. Good luck on that.
Oh, let's try that. Is that working? Yes. Is that working? Okay, that's better. Almost forgot the question. So, okay, existing specifiers. Yeah, I think it's simple. I think there's a lot to deep dive into there. And it's engaging, I guess, with the supply chain. I think a lot of people can hear Chinese whispers from a lot of places in terms of what testing is happening for how they should specify powder coatings. I think the more complicated you go into it, the more tangled you then end up becoming. So I made reference to coating thicknesses there, which is a big area.
Can you swap over?
What it was? Sure. There we go. So yeah, I was talking about coating thicknesses and how maybe that should be specified, I think. Is that working better? Yeah, that's better. So I think it's a case of not trying to overcomplicate things by maybe specifying a maximum thickness, because I think the key thing is when we're talking about those upper tolerances, those are mean tolerances, not absolute tolerances. So making sure you embed that somewhere so everybody is singing off the same hymn sheet. And there's only two specifications or two classifications that actually are permissible. That's A1 and A2 S1 D0. Anything outside of that, then you're entering into the worlds of being a risk. For any building, not just those over 18 metres. So keep things simple, stick to the standards, engage with the supply chain, and if you're ever unsure, as I said, speak to us and reach out to us. I think that'll be the overriding message.
So you avoid actually specifying specific thicknesses.
I think
you look for an average thickness, do you?
Yeah, so we've tested as an average mean thickness, not an absolute thickness, where I think some people sometimes interpret it as an absolute. And that's where you enter into problems, particularly for these guys who have to actually do the work and coat the work. So, as I said, it's a case of making sure you read the test reports per the manufacturer's test report, not just generic ones. Look to see what the tolerances are there. If that's what you want to specify, then be prescriptive and say, as per that test report, these are the tolerances that we should work to.
What complications does that give you then, Tristan?
I'll just reiterate, keep it simple. Quote A2, because sometimes we'll get specs quoted default test like the old BS standards. So just quote for the latest standard for A2. Quote, and from there we kind of know what we've got to do then. If we spray an AXO powder, we'll pull their certificate. We've got to spray it to this average, and then we'll take it from there. So as long as we know it's A2, then we'll just kind of take over and pull the certificate pretty much to 110 for most of them as the average. We're usually around about 80, so we're usually quite well in. It's not difficult to achieve that A2 standard.
What about the exemptions part of this? Because there are exemptions, aren't there, in the building regs?
There's exemptions for windows, but it doesn't count your infills or the panels that go above or below. So it doesn't really matter. If you just say A2, it's not difficult for us to produce to A2, so it doesn't really matter if you bound and brace to specify it for a window. We won't say, oh, that's exempt. We'll just spray it to that thickness and say, yeah, then because it's not a massive challenge for the coaters,
right,
to keep within those limits.
But what about the suppliers then of the powder coating? Does that affect you? I mean, you're supplying systems, are you not?
I'll get the microphone. Yes, we're supplying systems, but as Tristan was saying, the default setting, if you like, for meeting the QUALICOAT standard is that sort of 60 to 80 micron film thickness.
Yeah.
So immediately, as long as they're following the QUALICOAT standard, they will come in line with the requirements to achieve the A2 S1D0 setting. Our powders, talking about the different thicknesses, we've had ours tested at 60 microns and also 120 microns, and it's still passing for the A2 S1D0 spec.
I mean, we're talking about the UK here, but does the rest of the world have a similar outlook on the fire risk element?
It's an interesting question. I think, well, fortunately for other countries, they haven't had their own Grenfell. And I think it takes something that drastic for people to start to take notice. So there's been a couple of instances in Australia, a couple of instances in the Middle East over the last 4 or 5 years where they've had tall kind of skyscrapers literally on flames. And that's obviously created its own media attention, but nobody has really died from the back of it. So I think if you look at continental Europe, that they just see it as a UK issue. But then the interesting thing is, you look at projects being installed here in this city, a lot of the unitized systems are not fabricated in the UK, they're not coated in the UK, coated abroad. And it's incumbent on those countries to know what they're actually supplying into the UK market. So yeah, it's very much UK because of what's happened. We're definitely ahead of the curve in terms of looking at the nitty-gritty details in terms of what needs to be done, what's safe, what's not. I think the rest of the world are paying a bit of lip service to it, and as I said, apart from those 2 countries, they haven't been as inspected as we have. So it's really us trying to fight the corner in terms of safety more than anything else.
I mean, is it the fire risk from the powder coating itself? Is that what we're looking at all the time?
In general, no. I think, okay, certain materials, as long as it meets those 2 classifications, that's not necessarily what's causing it. It's what happens behind the system, which tends to be the main cause of it. So how it's put together, those cavity depths, where the fire breaks are, those things are not specified properly. That's the main cause of most fire. Obviously with Grenfell, that was a different story whereby they used literally a solid petrol sort of insulation, which obviously has quite a high combustibility and flammability element. So that's obviously propelled that particular instance. But when it comes to most installations which doesn't involve those types of installations, it's generally what goes on behind the panel that you see, as opposed to what's in front of it.
I mean, can the standards be harmonised? We've got the British standards, and then we've got QUALICOAT. Can there be harmonisation with all these standards?
Well, the QUALICOAT standard encompasses the 12206 standard anyway, so it takes all of that into account. So if you're working to BS 12206, you can then sort of push towards QUALICOAT. QUALICOAT takes it a little step further.
Yeah.
So if somebody specified QUALICOAT and want work doing to the QUALICOAT standard, pretty much automatically getting the 12206 anyway. So it's they sort of work hand in hand, the 2 standards.
Right, so it can never really be completely harmonised then, because QUALICOAT's always going to be a higher standard.
At this stage, then yes.
I wouldn't say so for fire. As an applicator, I'd rather see the EN standard quoted that's in the building regs than British standards or QUALICOAT. So when it comes to fire, I'd rather just see the EN standard A2 requirement for the fire specification.
But
You kind of know where we are. When you start quoting the RBS standard or QUALICOAT, for the fire part, quote the EN standard and for the A2.
But how do you then get everybody to do as you're saying there? Because suddenly I'm now confused that we've got all these different standards, and you're saying use EN, and then there's QUALICOAT, and then there's the British standard. Who knows what to specify?
It's the EN standard that's quoted in the building regs. So if you go back
Right,
to
okay.
the latest building regs, we're using the EN35 standard.
Yeah, EN 13501.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
essentially what's written in Part B regs.
Yeah.
That's what you have to comply with. And in general, that's EN 13501. For certain buildings, they can accept the full-scale test, which is 8414. So those tend to be related to fire. Obviously, QUALICOAT is an all-encompassing sort of standard which doesn't incorporate fire into it. But obviously, the products need to comply with those harmonised European standards. But there is still this grey area between the old British standards, which people still use. That's where it gets a bit murky. People still quote the old British standards, which used to be BS 476, without boring people into too much detail. That's embedded in a lot of people's heads, and all this Class 1, Class O rating, and that's literally out of the picture. That's where this harmonised standard is meant to supersede all of that, and you shouldn't really go back to where we were kind of pre-Grenfell, essentially.
Okay, well, just to throw another spanner in the works, I've got written down here, does QUALICOAT UK and Ireland have a stated position on the combustibility of coatings? Good luck.
I think they tend to rely on the system suppliers that are in the network to dictate exactly what those tolerances are. So as long as the applications and the applicators can work to those tolerances, then it will basically harmonise and align with what the standard requires. So whilst it doesn't specifically have sort of a section with regards to fire, it just says, look, you just need to make sure that both the manufacturers of the powders and those who apply it are working to the right tolerances. As long as they are, you've got a safe installation.
So it's not necessary for QUALICOAT to actually have a statement about combustibility as such?
I think it's incumbent on QUALICOAT to obviously sort of mention it in the specs, but in terms of what the core areas that QUALICOAT focus on, those tend to differ in terms of what's required in the sort of fire reg. So those two things should be kept separate, but again, leaning on the members of the network to basically ensure that they are compliant in terms of what they're processing day in, day out, essentially.
Are there any questions that anybody wants to raise?
Two good systems, particularly for products like perforated sheet, which are functional as well as aesthetic benefits, but the risks in terms of sharp edges are multiplied by the thousands. Two good systems used for that. Some hazardous seaside applications in time advantage as well. So they're out the window for this specification.
Well, obviously you've got those mean tolerances that you have to work to. It becomes very difficult once you start getting more than one layer involved to try and control those thicknesses. Perforation is an interesting one. It's something which potentially, depending on the type and the size of the perforations, you've got more or less surface area to work from. Essentially, you've got two sides where obviously the heat's not affecting the back side, but the underside of the panel. But obviously the heat can transfer through, and that's where you potentially got two layers of organic matter. So that's a question which is still unanswered, but there's testing underway to confirm what those will be. But from our point of view, and just to be on the sort of risk aversion side, we're saying single coat applications only at this moment in time, just because we know we can control those. And obviously, yeah, I get your point with regards to perforations. That's where you almost need to do some testing to see whether you've got sufficient edge coverage on those areas. But you can't take any risks when it comes to sort of harmonising with the standards, because the fire engineer will look at the test and say, okay, that's done on a flat sheet, one-sided. What's going to happen over two-sided? And that's a question which is currently unanswered, but will be answered soon. And at least that way we can give some more guidance to the marketplace.
A question from Panam. Who would you like this directed at?
Well, it's not a question, it's actually more information, because I understood from the deliberation we missed one key element. That at QUALICOAT now we have introduced requirements for powder to state if it's actually carries the standard. So this is something that will link all what you mentioned, because you said, how come that this is, what shall I actually specify? And then later we'll talk about how to, but this is the beginning of it, because as Ivo was saying, as an organization, we're a global standard, and in some countries, they absolutely have no idea about what we're talking about because they've never faced it. So at QUALICOAT, we've started the journey about actually linking that and making sure that when you actually specify QUALICOAT, the current edition, we look after the fire retardancy and protection as well. So it's just as a general point and information.
Professor.
So a piece of information, I wrote in the Architects Journal in 1988 the rain screen cladding having a cavity behind it. and so to have the tragedy of Grenfell all those years later is deeply regrettable, to say the least. And I was very pleased to see full-scale testing, because I think there's not been enough testing and whole-scale testing. So do you think in a sense the industry being forced into doing what they should always have been doing? Or is it, or in put simply, is enough testing really happening?
Yeah, interesting question. I think if you look at that full-scale testing, not cheap testing, it's 70, 80 grand that people are going to commit to, but ultimately it gives people assurances. I think the main limitations that people often draw upon 8414 tests is whatever you test, every increment that you use, that can't deviate in terms of what's installed in the building. So I think that's where a lot of people say, okay, well, if I change this particular component, this fixing here, will that change it? So that's where I think it falls down a little bit. But ultimately, it's the only fair means of actually testing how everything put together actually behaves as a complete system, which, you know, I think you can have all these EN 13501 standalone reports, but how do you assemble that into a bigger picture and actually say, okay, well, you put these 4 or 5 constituent parts together and they're all going to perform in the same way. You just don't know unless it's subjected to testing. I think most people who are system suppliers in this room have gone down that route, and it's good that they've done so, but not everyone has. But I suspect with the updates in the regulations, that time may come fairly soon. I think people want that extra assurance, even if they can't fully transfer that particular testing for that particular project. At least it gives them some confidence that as a system that it can perform to what it should do.
Stuart, I'm very conscious of the fact that you keep holding a microphone, and we have the Naveen show. If there's anything you want to come in on, please do so. In fact, there's a question coming from over here.
It's a question for the entire panel. First one, Frank Stacy just predicted future specification would include an increased life cycle criteria. And then in the Lean's presentation, there was a mention of a maximum thickness paint which achieves a certain fire rating. So is the panel expecting a conflict with that between the two requirements of longevity versus fire safety?
Again, with the specification for the film thickness, again, working to QUALICOAT standard, you're looking at that sort of circa 80 microns as the average thickness. Some colours slightly more, some of them less. Our powders have been tested, as I say, up to 120 microns. So even if you do go over that average film thickness, and somebody specified that they wanted up to that because of giving the protection for the lifetime of the building, then we're still achieving the A2 S1 D0 requirements, but also extending the lifetime of the building. If that answers your question.
So that is why the 8 years that we would be after.
The 80 years, well, you'd be hard pushed to get somebody to agree to an 80-year warranty. We can go up to 40 years. That's not to say that it won't last longer than that. We know in some cases, yes, it will do so. I think your presentation referenced that. We would normally look at the 40 years, but yes, it can go beyond 40 years. But what we're looking at with that is generally the colour and the gloss retention. So that's how we as powder manufacturers would sort of base our results on that.
And with that, that wraps up this panel. I'm going to win us about a minute back, I think, by ending it here. Thank you very much, Tristan, and obviously Naveen. and Stuart, and thank you for your time and your input.